On October 6, 1973, the Egyptian army breached the Bar-Lev Line along the Suez Canal, Israel's most expensive and symbolically powerful defensive system, in a matter of hours. Not with bombers. Not with massed artillery. But with water. High-pressure pumps carved through sand walls once believed to be impassable, opening corridors wide enough for tens of thousands of troops. A defensive line designed to delay an invasion for days collapsed before Israeli command could fully react. Why did a fortification built to withstand modern firepower fail against a method so basic it barely registered as a threat? Why did Israeli planners, famous for contingency thinking, never seriously account for this possibility? And why did Egyptian commanders stake their entire opening move on a solution that looked, on paper, dangerously fragile? Because this was not an engineering trick. It was a strategic wager, built on breaking assumptions, compressing time, and forcing the enemy to respond inside the wrong mental framework. This episode is not about how the canal was crossed. It is about why this idea was allowed to exist at all, and what it cost. The strategic problem Egypt faced before October 1973 was not how to defeat Israel outright. That option did not exist. Israel held decisive advantages in air power, armored maneuver, rapid mobilization, and operational experience. Any attempt to fight a symmetrical war, deep thrusts, prolonged engagements, or decisive battles of annihilation, would almost certainly end the same way it had in 1967. The real problem was narrower, and more dangerous to confront honestly. How does a weaker force initiate a war without triggering the enemy's full strategic superiority before achieving any irreversible gain? The Bar-Lev Line stood at the center of this dilemma. It was not just a physical barrier. It was a time machine designed to buy Israel hours, then days, until reserves arrived and the balance of power reasserted itself. Egypt could not afford time. It needed compression. Shock. A fait accompli created before doctrine, bureaucracy, and mobilization could catch up. That is why this episode qualifies as a genuinely unorthodox strategy. Not because it used water instead of explosives, but because it redefined what breaking through was supposed to mean. And to understand why such a gamble was even considered, we first need to map the battlefield, not as it looked on paper, but as it constrained every decision before the first pump was switched on. To understand why the Bar-Lev Line mattered so much, it is necessary to strip the battlefield down to its real components. Not arrows on a map. Not unit designations. But constraints, physical, political, psychological, that defined what was possible and what was not. In 1973, Egypt and Israel were not simply two armies facing each other across a canal. They were two strategic systems operating under radically different tolerances for risk, time, and loss. For Israel, the Suez Canal was not a front line. It was a buffer. The Bar-Lev Line existed to absorb the first shock of any Egyptian attack. Its purpose was delay. Hold long enough for reserves, Israel's real military strength, to mobilize, move south, and re-establish dominance. This logic was deeply embedded in Israeli defense planning. The fortifications did not need to be indestructible. They only needed to slow the enemy. That assumption shaped everything that followed. For Egypt, the canal was not a buffer. It was a wall. Crossing it was the prerequisite for any political or military credibility. Without a successful crossing, no negotiation, no deterrence, and no restoration of national standing after 1967 was possible. But Egypt also understood a harsher reality. Crossing too deeply, or advancing too far beyond the canal, would expose its forces to Israeli air and armor in open terrain, a scenario Egypt was unlikely to survive. This created a paradoxical objective. Egypt needed to cross the canal decisively, yet limit what came after. The terrain reinforced this contradiction. The eastern bank of the canal rose sharply, dominated by sand ramparts reinforced over years. Behind them sat strongpoints, firing positions, and pre-registered artillery zones. Beyond that lay open desert, terrain favoring Israeli maneuver warfare. Time was the most unforgiving constraint of all. Israeli doctrine assumed early warning. Signals intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, and human sources were expected to provide enough notice for mobilization. Even partial warning could trigger a cascade of defensive preparations. Egypt's window, therefore, was narrow. Not days. Not even a full day. It needed to achieve a visible, irreversible success before Israel's system fully activated. Logistics added another layer of pressure. Egypt's army had improved since 1967, but it remained dependent on centralized supply, limited bridging equipment, and vulnerable command networks. Any prolonged, contested crossing under fire would bleed manpower and momentum rapidly. This is where the Bar-Lev Line's symbolic weight became strategically dangerous. For Israeli planners, the line represented rational engineering applied to rational assumptions. Sand walls absorb explosions. Fortifications anchor defense. A canal restricts movement. These were all correct, within the context of expected methods of attack. Notice the hidden clause, expected methods. What the system was not designed to handle was speed achieved through simplicity. High command Israeli thinking treated the canal crossing as an inherently slow, noisy, escalatory process. Bridging operations would take time. Engineers would need protection. Heavy equipment would telegraph intent. Every step would be observable, and therefore disruptible. That belief created a blind spot. Because if the crossing could be made fast enough, the line's purpose collapsed. Delay was its only function. Once delay disappeared, the fortifications lost strategic relevance. On the Egyptian side, constraints were just as severe, but of a different nature. Egyptian leadership was operating under political pressure that rarely appears on battlefield maps. President Anwar Sadat needed a military action that would change diplomatic dynamics without triggering catastrophic defeat. This was not a war for annihilation. It was a war for leverage. That distinction mattered. It allowed planners to think in terms of bounded objectives rather than total victory. But it also imposed discipline. Any plan that risked uncontrolled escalation was unacceptable. Any strategy that relied on prolonged offensive momentum was inherently unstable. The Egyptian command structure reflected this tension. Operational ambition was carefully constrained. Initiative was encouraged only within defined limits. Deviations beyond the canal bridgeheads were discouraged, not because of timidity, but because of strategic calculation. This cautious aggressiveness shaped the search for solutions. The problem was not, how do we destroy the Bar-Lev Line? It was, how do we neutralize its function quickly enough to make it irrelevant? That subtle reframing opened space for ideas that would otherwise be dismissed. At the same time, internal skepticism remained strong. Egyptian officers were acutely aware of their own vulnerabilities. Equipment reliability. Training gaps. Coordination under fire. No one assumed flawless execution, which made the emerging concept deeply uncomfortable. Using water pumps to breach sand walls sounded inelegant. Civilian. Improvised. It lacked the reassuring weight of doctrine. It did not look like a solution worthy of a strategic gamble. And yet, it addressed the problem directly. It did not seek to overpower the defense. It sought to bypass the logic of its construction. This is where the strategic map becomes more than geography. It becomes a cognitive diagram. On one side, a defender relying on time, early warning, and structured escalation. On the other, an attacker seeking compression, ambiguity, and speed, without signaling escalation too early. The Bar-Lev Line was the hinge between those systems. And hinges fail not when they are weak, but when force is applied from a direction they were never meant to resist. The irony is that both sides believed they understood the canal perfectly. Israel saw a controllable obstacle. Egypt saw a necessary threshold. Neither side initially treated it as a race. That misunderstanding would define the opening hours of the war. And it is precisely at this point, where constraints appear to eliminate all viable options, that the most dangerous question emerged inside Egyptian planning circles. If every conventional method guarantees failure, what happens if the only remaining option looks irrational? Military doctrine exists to reduce uncertainty. It offers tested sequences, validated tools, and established ratios of force. In theory, doctrine protects commanders from catastrophic improvisation. In practice, doctrine also narrows imagination. By 1973, the correct way to breach a fortified canal defense was well understood. Any professional staff college would outline the same solution set. Suppress with air power. Degrade with artillery. Commit engineers under cover. Build bridges. Expand the breach. Push armor through. Accept losses. Maintain momentum. On paper, it looked coherent. In reality, for Egypt, it was a dead end. Start with air power. Israel's Air Force held qualitative superiority in pilots, aircraft, and coordination. Any attempt to achieve air dominance over the canal would not only fail, it would expose Egypt's air assets early, inviting rapid attrition. Worse, it would signal the scale of Egyptian intent, triggering full Israeli mobilization before ground forces achieved anything irreversible. Doctrine assumes parity, or at least survivability. Egypt had neither. Artillery offered no salvation. While Egyptian artillery units were numerous, the Bar-Lev Line was designed to absorb bombardment. Sand ramparts dissipated blast effects. Fortified positions were hardened. Even successful strikes would require sustained fire over time Egypt did not possess. And sustained fire creates signatures. Radar tracks. Acoustic cues. Intelligence confirmation. The moment Egyptian artillery settled into a prolonged preparatory barrage, Israel's decision-making clock would start ticking at maximum speed. Engineering assaults were even more problematic. Conventional breaching demanded heavy equipment, bulldozers, explosives, bridging components. These assets are slow. They concentrate at predictable points. They require protection. And under fire, they fail spectacularly. Egyptian planners knew this. A traditional breach would turn the canal into a killing zone, engineers exposed, infantry pinned, bridges incomplete. Losses would mount before the crossing even began. Doctrine offered no workaround. Only escalation. This was the core contradiction. Every doctrinally correct option increased the probability of strategic failure. Yet rejecting doctrine introduces another danger: command paralysis. Armies are trained to mistrust solutions that cannot be formalized. A plan that cannot be drilled, standardized, and wargamed feels irresponsible, especially when national prestige is at stake. This is why most commanders, placed in Egypt's position, would still have chosen a conventional assault, despite knowing it would likely fail. Because failure within doctrine is explainable. Failure outside it is unforgivable. Doctrine also shaped Israeli expectations. Israeli planners did not imagine the Bar-Lev Line as invulnerable. They imagined it as resistant enough. Its value lay in buying time to mobilize reserves, deploy armor, and restore initiative. This expectation rested on one unspoken assumption. Any breach would be slow. Slow to prepare. Slow to execute. Slow to exploit. Doctrine reinforced this belief. Every known method of canal crossing involved sequential stages. Each stage generated warning. That belief structured Israeli command behavior. Initial signs of Egyptian activity could be interpreted as exercises, feints, or limited probes. The system was calibrated to escalate gradually. This calibration would prove fatal in the opening hours. Egyptian planners understood this dynamic with unsettling clarity. They recognized that the Bar-Lev Line did not need to be destroyed. It needed to be rendered irrelevant before Israeli doctrine could catch up. That meant the breach had to occur faster than Israeli escalation thresholds. Here is where doctrine completely broke down. There was no manual for compressing time. No checklist for achieving strategic surprise without technological superiority. Egyptian planners were forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable question. What if the correct solution is the one doctrine actively discourages? The emerging answer violated multiple doctrinal taboos. First, it prioritized simplicity over robustness. Second, it shifted effort from firepower to physics. Third, it accepted fragility as a feature, not a flaw. High-pressure water pumps did not appear in any military syllabus. They were civilian tools, adapted under controlled conditions. They lacked redundancy. They lacked protection. They lacked prestige. But they offered something doctrine could not: speed without escalation. Water could erode sand rapidly. It produced minimal acoustic signature. It did not require prolonged preparatory fire. Most importantly, it allowed breaches to be created almost simultaneously across multiple points, overwhelming the defender's ability to respond coherently. This was not a doctrinal improvement. It was a doctrinal bypass. Egyptian planners were not rejecting military science. They were exploiting its blind spots. Still, resistance was intense. Senior officers questioned reliability. What if pumps failed? What if sand collapsed unpredictably? What if the breaches were too narrow or unstable? These were not abstract concerns. They were existential. Because unlike a conventional assault, this plan offered no graceful degradation. Either it worked quickly, or it collapsed entirely. Doctrine normally allows commanders to adjust, reinforce, redirect, pause. This plan allowed none of that. Which raises the most revealing point of all. This strategy did not emerge because it was optimal. It emerged because every safer option had already failed in theory. That is why this was not innovation born of confidence, but innovation born of constraint. Egyptian command was not asking, what is the best way to attack? They were asking, what is the only way left that does not guarantee defeat? Doctrine had answered every other question, and closed every other door. And once that realization took hold, the debate shifted from feasibility to courage. Could the Egyptian command accept a plan that looked improvised, fragile, and professionally embarrassing? Could they commit to an opening move that would either succeed spectacularly or expose them to immediate catastrophe? Because once doctrine is abandoned, there is no shelter. Only consequences. And it is at this exact moment, when institutional knowledge fails, and risk becomes personal, that strategy stops being theoretical and starts being human. Unorthodox strategies do not emerge fully formed. They surface slowly, under pressure, through resistance. The idea of using high-pressure water to breach the Bar-Lev sand ramparts did not originate as a bold strategic vision. It began as a technical workaround, an attempt to solve a narrow engineering problem that doctrine had already deemed unsolvable with an acceptable risk. The question was simple. How do you remove a massive sand wall quickly, without explosives, without prolonged exposure, and without announcing your intent? Early discussions treated the sand itself as the problem. Its height, its slope, its compaction. The implicit assumption remained intact: the defense must be broken. The shift came when planners stopped asking how strong the sand was, and started asking how stable it actually was under sustained erosion. This was not a military insight. It was a physical one. Once that door opened, the implications were unsettling. If water could displace sand faster than explosives could fragment it, then the entire defensive logic of the Bar-Lev Line rested on a fragile material illusion. But recognizing a possibility is not the same as endorsing it. Inside Egyptian command, the proposal triggered immediate skepticism. Not because it was clearly wrong, but because it violated too many professional instincts at once. Senior officers raised objections that were entirely rational. Water pumps were not military-grade equipment. They were vulnerable. They were unarmored. They relied on uninterrupted operation. What if Israeli fire disabled them? What if mechanical failure occurred mid-breach? What if erosion behaved unpredictably, creating unstable slopes unusable for infantry and vehicles? Each question exposed the same underlying fear: this plan offered no buffer against error. Traditional assaults fail gradually. This one would fail all at once. The internal debate revealed a deeper fault line, not between innovation and conservatism, but between different understandings of risk. Conventional planning spreads risk across time, units, and layers of redundancy. Losses are expected but managed. Failure is incremental. This plan concentrated risk into the opening hours. It traded endurance for immediacy. Supporters of the plan did not argue that it was safe. They argued that it was bounded. If the breaches succeeded, Egypt would achieve its limited objectives quickly and dig in. If they failed, the war would be lost early, but no later option promised a better outcome. That logic reframed the debate. This was not a question of elegance or professionalism. It was a question of accepting an early verdict. At the heart of the decision lay a set of assumptions, each individually plausible, collectively dangerous. First, that Israeli detection would not escalate fast enough to prevent the breaches. Second, that erosion rates would be sufficient under battlefield conditions, not just controlled tests. Third, that Egyptian infantry could move fast enough to exploit the openings before Israeli response solidified. None of these assumptions could be proven in advance. They were judgments. And judgments, unlike calculations, attach responsibility to individuals. This is where leadership mattered. Egyptian high command did not adopt the plan because it promised certainty. They adopted it because it aligned with a strategic ceiling they had already accepted. Egypt was not seeking deep penetration. It was not planning operational exploitation beyond the canal zone. Its objective was positional and political, not annihilative. Within that framework, the water breach concept made grim sense. It targeted not Israeli firepower, but Israeli tempo. It aimed to win the first 6 hours, not the entire war. That temporal framing changed how risk was evaluated. If Israeli command required time to verify, assess, mobilize, and coordinate, then speed itself became a weapon. The plan did not need to be resilient. It needed to be faster than Israeli adaptation. This is a critical distinction often missed in retrospective analysis. The strategy was not designed to survive prolonged contact. It was designed to create an irreversible fact before contact stabilized. This explains why the plan focused obsessively on simultaneity. Breaches would occur across multiple points along the canal, not sequentially. Israeli defenders would face not a single crisis, but several incomplete ones at once. No single breach would appear decisive, until all of them existed. This was a deliberate attack on command cognition. Multiple small failures are easier to dismiss than one obvious catastrophe. By the time the pattern became undeniable, the window for prevention would have closed. In that sense, the water pumps were not merely tools. They were timing devices. Every minute they ran uninterrupted reduced Israeli options. The final approval of the plan reflected this brutal clarity. Egyptian leadership understood that once initiated, the operation could not be paused. There would be no recalibration based on early feedback. No escalation ladder to climb. The pumps would either carve passages, or they would not. This forced an unusual form of discipline. Commanders were instructed to resist the instinct to exploit success too far. The temptation to advance deeper into Sinai was real, and potentially fatal. The entire strategy depended on not exceeding its design limits. This restraint is often misread as lack of ambition. It was the opposite. It was recognition that the plan's strength lay in precision, not momentum. One further aspect deserves attention: morale. For Egyptian forces, the method itself carried psychological weight. It replaced years of frustration with a concrete, executable task. Soldiers were not asked to storm an impregnable wall. They were asked to assist a process already underway. This mattered. The sense that the defense was dissolving, rather than being assaulted, changed the emotional texture of the crossing. It turned an act of courage into an act of inevitability. For Israeli defenders, the effect would be inverted. A fortification expected to delay now vanished under pressure that felt almost non-military. That cognitive dissonance would complicate immediate response. But all of this remained theoretical until execution. On paper, the plan aligned perfectly with Egypt's strategic constraints. In reality, it balanced on an edge thinner than most histories admit. Because every assumption still had to survive contact with physics, fear, and friction. And if even one of them failed, if erosion slowed, if pumps stalled, if Israeli fire arrived minutes earlier, then the entire conceptual elegance would collapse into chaos. That was the price of abandoning doctrine. And that price would be tested not in planning rooms, but on an exposed canal bank, under fire, with no margin for hesitation. Strategy only exists as long as it can be executed under stress. For the Egyptian plan, execution was not a secondary concern, it was the entire battlefield. The moment the operation began, theory lost its protective distance. What followed was not a test of courage or numbers, but a test of whether a fragile mechanism could survive its first contact with reality. The water breach concept depended on a simple sequence. Pumps would be brought forward. Hoses would be positioned. Water would be directed at specific sections of the sand wall. Erosion would occur fast enough to create ramps. Infantry would cross immediately. Engineers would stabilize the openings. Bridges would follow. Every step was vulnerable. The pumps themselves were the most obvious point of failure. They were not armored. They were not designed for combat conditions. They required fuel, coordination, and uninterrupted operation. A single artillery strike, a strafing run, or even mechanical malfunction could halt the process. And yet, these machines were pushed forward deliberately, almost brazenly. This was not recklessness. It was calculation. Egyptian planners understood that the pump's very ordinariness worked in their favor. They did not resemble military bridging equipment. They did not immediately signal a large-scale assault. Their acoustic and visual signatures were limited. In the opening moments, this ambiguity mattered. Israeli forward observers faced an unfamiliar picture. Activity was visible, but it did not conform to known assault patterns. There was no sustained bombardment. No massive bridging effort. No clear escalation marker. This uncertainty bought minutes. Minutes were everything. As the pumps began to operate, the physics of the plan took over. High-pressure water struck compacted sand that had been shaped to resist blasts, not erosion. The material behaved differently than expected under explosive force. Instead of dispersing energy, it yielded. Channels formed quickly, then widened. But erosion is not a controlled process. Sand collapses unpredictably. Slopes can fail. What looks like a breach can become a trap if walls cave in at the wrong moment. This created a second layer of risk: usability. A hole in the defense was meaningless if infantry could not move through it safely. Vehicles required stable gradients. Even foot soldiers risked being slowed or injured by shifting terrain. Egyptian assault units had to commit before perfection was achieved. Waiting for ideal conditions would defeat the purpose. This introduced a brutal trade-off. Move too early, and troops enter unstable breaches. Move too late, and Israeli response catches up. Commanders on the ground were forced to make decisions without precedent, guided by judgment rather than drill. This is where friction asserted itself. Some pumps underperformed. Some breaches progressed slower than anticipated. In certain sectors, erosion stalled as sand compacted differently than expected. Engineers had to reposition hoses under fire, adjusting angles, compensating for flow issues. These were not dramatic setbacks, but they were cumulative. Each delay consumed the only resource the strategy truly depended on: time. At the same moment, Israeli defenders began to understand that something unusual was happening. Reports filtered upward, fragmented, inconsistent, incomplete. Sand walls were disappearing. Infantry was appearing where none should be. The absence of a familiar preparatory phase delayed decisive interpretation. Meanwhile, Egyptian infantry crossed in waves, exploiting whatever gaps existed. Their role was not to advance deeply, but to establish presence. To occupy. To signal permanence. This distinction is critical. The strategy did not require immediate tactical dominance. It required irreversibility. Once troops were across in sufficient numbers, removing them would demand escalation, airstrikes, armor, coordination, all of which required time. But irreversibility cuts both ways. If the crossing stalled before reaching the threshold, Egyptian forces would be exposed, fragmented, and vulnerable. There were moments when this outcome seemed plausible. In some sectors, Israeli fire intensified faster than expected. Strongpoints that had survived initial confusion began to engage. Egyptian troops crossing under fire took losses. Casualties mounted, particularly among early waves. The plan had no buffer for this. There was no reserve method to accelerate breaching. No fallback to explosives without changing the entire operational signature. The pumps could not be replaced mid-action. This rigidity was the price of speed. And yet, the system held, just enough. Simultaneous breaches along multiple points created a cognitive overload for Israeli command. No single sector appeared decisive enough to justify full commitment. Each looked like a localized problem, until the aggregate effect became undeniable. By then, Egyptian forces had crossed in numbers sufficient to entrench. This is where logistics quietly became the determining factor. Supplying troops across the canal required sustained effort under fire. Ammunition, medical evacuation, command coordination, all had to function without the robust infrastructure that a completed bridging operation would normally provide. Egyptian logistics were strained immediately. But again, the strategy did not require long-term sustainability in the opening phase. It required continuity long enough to force a strategic response. That response, once triggered, would occur under unfavorable conditions. It is tempting to view the success of the breaching as inevitable in hindsight. It was not. Had Israeli air power been unleashed minutes earlier, the exposed pumps and infantry would have been devastated. Had erosion failed at more points simultaneously, congestion would have turned breaches into choke points. The margin was narrow. This was not a triumph of overwhelming force. It was survival within tolerance. The most revealing aspect of the execution phase is how little room there was for improvisation. Once the pump started, the plan owned the commanders, not the other way around. This inversion of control is rare in military history. Normally, plans serve commanders. Here, commanders served the plan. That alone should signal how unconventional this strategy truly was. Because strategies that demand obedience rather than adaptation carry an implicit threat, they expose human decision-makers to consequences they cannot manage once events diverge. The Egyptian command accepted that risk. They accepted that the opening hours would determine the war's character. Not its final outcome, but its strategic geometry. And when the initial crossings succeeded, not flawlessly, but sufficiently, the character of the conflict changed irreversibly. The Bar-Lev Line had not been destroyed. It had been rendered irrelevant. What followed was no longer a question of whether Egypt could cross the canal. That question had already been answered. The new question, far more dangerous, was how Israel would respond once it fully understood what had happened. Because misinterpretation had bought Egypt time. But recognition would bring consequences. And those consequences would expose the second half of the strategy, one that depended not on water or sand, but on how an opponent reacts when their assumptions collapse. No defense fails the moment it is breached. It fails the moment its response logic no longer matches reality. When Israeli forces first received reports from the canal, there was no single, coherent picture. What came in were fragments, localized alerts, confused descriptions, partial confirmations. Sand walls collapsing. Egyptian troops appearing on the east bank. Strongpoints under pressure earlier than expected. Individually, none of these signals demanded immediate strategic escalation. Collectively, they should have. But systems do not react to collectives. They react to patterns they recognize. Israeli doctrine had trained commanders to expect a familiar sequence: preparatory fire, engineering activity, bridge construction, mass movement. None of that was clearly visible. What they saw instead looked incomplete. Improvised. Tactical. This created the first and most critical delay. Initial Israeli interpretation framed the crossings as limited incursions, not a decisive operation. The Bar-Lev Line was expected to bend, not snap. Local commanders believed they could contain the situation until reserves arrived. This belief was not arrogance. It was doctrinal consistency. The Israeli command system was optimized for measured escalation. Early warning would trigger partial mobilization. Confirmation would trigger full response. The process was designed to avoid overreaction. In this case, caution became paralysis. While Israeli commanders debated the scale of the Egyptian action, the logic of the water breach strategy continued to operate in silence. Egyptian infantry entrenched. Engineers widened passages. Numbers increased. The threshold of irreversibility crept closer. Another factor compounded the delay: confidence in technological superiority. Israeli planning assumed that any large-scale crossing attempt would inevitably expose itself to air attack. This assumption had been correct in previous conflicts. Air power had always been the ultimate corrective force. But air power requires targeting clarity. The absence of large bridges, heavy equipment, and massed formations complicated rapid air response. Targets were dispersed. Timelines were compressed. The expected visual cues were missing. By the time Israeli air assets were committed decisively, the situation had shifted. Egyptian forces were no longer crossing. They were present. This distinction matters. Air power is most effective against movement, not occupation. Once infantry is dug in, intermingled, and supported by surface-to-air defenses, the cost-benefit equation changes. The second Israeli miscalculation lay in command rigidity. Israeli reserve mobilization was fast, but not instantaneous. The system relied on precise timing and coordination. Early hesitation disrupted that rhythm. Partial alerts led to partial responses. Units arrived in staggered fashion, without unified operational context. This fragmentation reduced the shock value of Israeli counteraction. Moreover, the psychological impact of the breach was underestimated. Bar-Lev Line strongpoints were designed to delay, not to be abandoned. Their rapid isolation forced difficult choices on local commanders: hold positions that were no longer tactically decisive, or withdraw under pressure. Neither option was clean. Holding risked encirclement. Withdrawing conceded symbolic ground. These dilemmas consumed attention and energy at precisely the wrong moment. The Egyptian strategy exploited this distraction deliberately. By creating multiple, modest-looking crises instead of one overwhelming one, it forced Israeli command to distribute focus. There was no single decisive target to crush. Every response seemed necessary and insufficient. This is where institutional blind spots surfaced. Israeli doctrine emphasized decisive counterattack. But decisive action requires clarity. When clarity is absent, decisiveness erodes. The water breach strategy did not overwhelm Israel's ability to fight. It overwhelmed its ability to prioritize. Once Israeli command fully grasped the scale of the crossings, the opportunity to prevent them had already passed. Countermeasures shifted from prevention to containment. At that point, the strategic initiative had changed hands. This does not mean Israel failed to respond effectively in the broader war. It means that in the opening phase, the phase that mattered most for Egypt's objectives, Israeli response was misaligned. The key error was not tactical hesitation. It was conceptual delay. Israeli planners had prepared for a breach that unfolded over time. They encountered a breach that unfolded before their escalation logic could activate. This mismatch exposed a fundamental vulnerability in highly structured command systems. They are excellent at responding to known problems, and slow to interpret novel ones. The Egyptian strategy was built precisely around this insight. It did not require Israeli incompetence. It required Israeli normality. That is why retrospective critiques often miss the point. It is easy to say Israel should have reacted faster. Harder to admit that under the same assumptions, most professional militaries would have reacted the same way. Once the reality became undeniable, Israeli forces adjusted. Air power intensified. Counterattacks were planned. The war entered a different phase, one in which Israel's strengths would reassert themselves. But by then, the strategic damage was done. Egypt had crossed the canal. The Bar-Lev Line had failed in its primary mission. The psychological and political landscape had shifted. The opening move had achieved its purpose. And that raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If the strategy worked only because the opponent reacted normally, does that make it brilliant, or merely opportunistic? To answer that, we have to confront what the strategy actually cost, not in abstract terms, but in lives, strain, and consequences that extended far beyond the first successful hours. Because no unorthodox strategy escapes payment. And the bill always arrives after the applause fades. The success of the canal crossing is often described as a breakthrough. That word is misleading. What Egypt achieved in October 1973 was not a decisive military victory. It was something far narrower, and far more fragile, a controlled strategic reversal. The immediate outcome was clear. Egyptian forces established bridgeheads on the east bank of the Suez Canal. The Bar-Lev Line, designed to delay and shape Israeli response, failed to perform its primary function. Israel was forced to fight not to prevent a crossing, but to respond to one already in progress. That shift mattered more than any single tactical gain. For the first time since 1967, Egypt had imposed its will in the opening phase of a war against Israel. Not by overpowering Israeli forces, but by forcing them to operate outside their preferred tempo. This alone altered the psychological balance. But the strategy's success came with costs that are often softened or omitted. The human cost was immediate and unevenly distributed. The early waves of Egyptian infantry absorbed the highest risk. They crossed under fire, through unstable breaches, with limited cover and no guarantee that reinforcement would arrive in time. Casualties were significant, particularly in sectors where erosion progressed slowly or Israeli strongpoints reacted faster than anticipated. These losses were not accidental. They were structurally embedded in the plan. The strategy accepted that the opening hours would be expensive. What it sought was not casualty minimization, but temporal dominance, winning time at the cost of blood. From a purely strategic perspective, this trade was deemed acceptable. From a human perspective, it was brutal. Logistical strain followed quickly. Supplying forces across the canal under contested conditions stretched Egyptian support systems to their limits. Medical evacuation was constrained. Ammunition resupply was vulnerable. Command and control became increasingly complex as units operated on unfamiliar terrain under constant threat. The very restraint that defined the strategy, limiting advances to avoid overextension, created its own pressures. Forces had to hold exposed positions without the freedom to maneuver decisively. Static defense under air and artillery threat exacted a psychological toll. The political cost was more complex and more lasting. In the short term, the crossing achieved its intended effect. Egypt regained strategic credibility. Diplomatic dynamics shifted. The narrative of perpetual defeat was broken. But this success also locked leadership into a narrow corridor of legitimacy. Having demonstrated that Egypt could fight intelligently and effectively, any subsequent setback risked undoing that gain. Strategic restraint became harder to justify internally. Pressure mounted to translate the initial success into deeper advances, moves the original plan was not designed to support. This tension would haunt decision-making in the days that followed. On the Israeli side, the cost was equally profound. The failure of the Bar-Lev Line shook confidence in fixed defenses and early warning assumptions. The idea that a well-prepared system could be bypassed so quickly forced a painful reassessment, not just of engineering, but of strategic culture. For Israeli commanders, the opening phase was not merely a tactical surprise. It was a cognitive one. The war would eventually swing back in Israel's favor in operational terms. But the opening breach could not be undone. The psychological scar remained. This leads to the most important counterfactual question. What if the strategy had failed? If erosion had stalled at multiple points? If Israeli air power had responded minutes earlier? If command confusion had resolved faster? In that scenario, Egyptian forces would have been trapped mid-crossing, exposed, fragmented, and vulnerable. Losses would have been catastrophic. Political consequences would have been severe. The narrative of recovery would have collapsed. There was no safety net. This is what makes the strategy so difficult to categorize. It was not reckless, but it was unforgiving. It did not rely on luck, but it required conditions to align precisely. The margin between success and disaster was thin enough that outcome bias becomes tempting. Because it worked, it appears brilliant. Had it failed, it would be remembered as irresponsible. That ambiguity is inseparable from the strategy itself. Finally, there is the moral cost borne by decision-makers. Choosing this plan meant accepting that thousands of lives would be placed at heightened risk in the opening hours, with no possibility of course correction. It meant prioritizing strategic symbolism over tactical comfort. It meant embracing a form of command responsibility that allowed no retreat. This is not heroism. It is burden. The Egyptian leadership achieved what it set out to do, but only by accepting consequences it could neither fully predict nor fully control. And that is the uncomfortable truth behind most unorthodox strategies. They succeed not because they eliminate risk, but because they concentrate it. Which brings us to the final question. If this strategy was neither a clean victory nor a repeatable formula, what, exactly, does it teach us? Not about water pumps. Not about sand. But about how wars are actually opened. This episode is often reduced to a clever tactic, water cannons defeating sand walls. That reduction is comfortable and wrong. The canal crossing was not won by equipment. It was won by alignment of assumptions, timing, restraint, and psychological pressure. The method mattered only because everything around it had been engineered to let it matter. The first and most dangerous lesson is this. 1. Defenses fail at the level of assumptions, not materials. The Bar-Lev Line did not fail because it was poorly built. It failed because it was designed to answer the wrong question. Israeli planners asked, how do we stop a conventional, force-heavy crossing? Egyptian planners asked, how do we make the defender wait just long enough? The gap between those questions is where the strategy lived. Any system optimized for known threats will struggle with solutions that do not trigger its warning thresholds. The erosion technique exploited not a physical weakness, but a conceptual one. It looked too small, too slow, too incomplete to justify immediate escalation. The uncomfortable implication is that no amount of fortification fixes this problem. 2. Speed is not about movement, it is about decision compression. The crossing did not happen quickly because troops moved fast. They did not. It happened quickly because decisions were forced to occur earlier than the defender was prepared to make them. Israeli command had escalation gates, points at which certainty justified action. The Egyptian strategy was designed to arrive at full effect before those gates could close. This is what strategic speed looks like in modern warfare, not outrunning the enemy, but outpacing their decision framework. 3. Unorthodox strategies demand self-limitation. One of the least discussed aspects of the operation is what Egypt did not do. They did not rush armor across the canal. They did not pursue deep exploitation. They did not attempt to collapse Israeli forces entirely. This restraint was not weakness. It was survival. Unorthodox strategies are fragile. They rely on surprise, coherence, and timing. Overextension destroys all three. The moment Egypt attempted to behave like a conventional attacker, the logic of the strategy would have inverted. The lesson is counterintuitive. The more unconventional your opening, the more disciplined your follow-through must be. 4. Surprise is a process, not a moment. Surprise is often imagined as a single instant, an ambush, a revelation, a shock. The canal crossing shows that true surprise is cumulative. It is built through normalcy, repetition, and predictability. By training Israeli analysts to expect certain indicators, and then denying those indicators, the strategy manufactured surprise over time. This is far harder to defend against than a single deception. 5. Success does not equal replicability. Perhaps the most dangerous lesson is the one many draw incorrectly. That this can be done again. It cannot, at least not in the same way. The success of the strategy depended on specific geographic, technological, and doctrinal conditions. More importantly, it depended on an opponent whose mental models were stable and confident. Once exposed, such vulnerabilities rarely remain available. Unorthodox strategies are often one-use weapons. 6. The real victory was psychological and political. Militarily, the war would continue. Operational balances would shift. Losses would mount on both sides. But the opening crossing changed something that no later maneuver could undo: belief. Egypt proved, to itself, to its adversary, and to the world, that it could plan, execute, and absorb risk at a high strategic level. That proof mattered more than terrain. Wars are not decided only by what is taken, but by what is demonstrated. 7. Why this counts as an unusual campaign. This was not unusual because it used water instead of explosives. It was unusual because it inverted the relationship between strength and vulnerability. It made the defender's caution into an asset for the attacker. It used patience as an offensive weapon. Most campaigns aim to overwhelm. This one aimed to misalign. And that is the deeper lesson. The most dangerous strategies are not those that challenge your firepower. They are the ones that quietly render your logic obsolete, just long enough. That is what happened on the banks of the Suez Canal. And that is why this episode remains one of the clearest examples of how wars can be opened, not with force, but with insight. The breach of the Bar-Lev Line is often remembered as an engineering anomaly. That framing is convenient. It allows modern militaries to file the event away as a historical curiosity, clever, situational, and safely irrelevant. That interpretation is a mistake. What happened in October 1973 was not a triumph of improvisation over preparation. It was the opposite. It was preparation aimed at attacking the enemy's confidence in preparation itself. The Egyptian command did not ask how to overpower Israeli defenses. They asked how to enter the war without triggering the mechanisms designed to stop them. Water was simply the medium. The true weapon was the deliberate exploitation of institutional certainty. Certainty that barriers buy time. Certainty that attacks escalate in recognizable ways. Certainty that weakness announces itself loudly. By refusing to conform to those patterns, the operation forced Israeli command to respond inside a collapsing mental model. The delay was not technological. It was cognitive. This is why the strategy should not have worked. It violated too many rules at once. It replaced force with patience. It substituted penetration with erosion. It gambled national credibility on a method that looked reversible until it wasn't. And yet, for a brief and decisive window, it succeeded. That window did not exist because Israel was incompetent. It existed because highly rational systems are slow to accept that their own logic has become a liability. The uncomfortable lesson is not about pumps, sand, or canals. It is about how modern defense thinking, when optimized for known threats, creates blind zones for ideas that appear too small, too crude, or too uneconomical to matter. Those blind zones are where unorthodox campaigns are born. The Bar-Lev Line was not defeated by water. It was defeated by a strategy that understood one simple truth. The most expensive defenses in history are often guarding against the wrong question.